So hello, everyone. Thanks for joining us today. And as alluded to already, I'm giving you an update on the Archetypal Aquifer project. So this is a 2021 update. Before progressing into the slide deck, I'd just like to acknowledge all the contributors to this presentation. First and foremost, the GSC contributors that are listed on this first slide. And also collaborators at a variety of organizations, academic, private sector, and government, who also contribute significantly to this. As you can deduce already from the list of names here, it's a large team effort, and I'm simply a representative of all the players. I'd like to particularly acknowledge external funding sources for this project, which in the Ottawa area specifically is the City of Ottawa, and we'll get around to discussing some of their contributions to supporting aquitard studies later on. So just to nod our head to COVID, it would seem rather amiss not to acknowledge the presence it's had on work practices and productivity in the last year. And it's been both a negative and a positive influence. And activity leads have adapted with, I think, a great deal of resourcefulness and patience to a range of challenges. And overall, activities are progressing quite well given some of the constraints. The biggest issue is obviously being locked out of the building and non-access to laboratories. And secondly, an inability to complete field work. But the first of those is back on track, and people have adapted well to working from home. And as this presentation highlights, we've all improved our virtual presentation skills, or I hope this presentation will demonstrate that. So the content, it's structured under these four general topics or headings: field laboratories with three subsections: geochemistry or PXRF, portable X-ray fluorescence protocol and data releases. Then the Bilberry Creek aquitard study, and we'll touch on 3D geological modeling. Now, you may have seen, or the title of the project is Archetypal Aquifers. And last year, we talked a lot about consolidating 30 years of groundwater studies at the GSC under that rubric. And that would have involved a classification scheme and then population of the archetypes and a move away from landscape sediment categorization of superficial aquifers, particularly. And that activity is on hold. It was sort of supplanted by the Canada One Water Initiative, which we'll talk about later on. So from field laboratories, the focus is on methods development, and it also contributes to our there's three sort of elements being discussed here: the regional component in the Ottawa area, the Bells Corners calibration facility, and the Embrun borehole setting with geophysics. And the image on the right just highlights the distribution of superficial sediment thickness and bedrock, and is an illustration of how it's a very good test bed, particularly for seismic methods development. And that's our first item. So there's two components to seismic methods development being pursued: reflection seismic and then passive HVSR seismic, and both involve regional data collection. The map on the left highlights that seismic reflection data collection in the red lines terrestrially, and areas of waterborne data collection in the blue boxes. And that data, or that work, is focused on source development, particularly water-based, and images on the left-hand side of the slide highlight some of that work. Microvibe development, so downscaling of the energy source to a portable, lightweight energy source that can actually be transported by aircraft. And then mini-vibe upgrades. And then post-data collection, there's also an emphasis on enhanced signal processing, both from a three-component perspective, so the compression shear wave components of the signal, and also the frequency content. And just to touch a little bit on some of the inset images. So the top left image is an early version of an energy source for waterborne seismic. Pretty fundamental, a hammer hitting an object, a metal object in a metal boat, which resonates through the water column. And an indication of the high quality data that's available from that source is shown in the lower left corner. Both of these are from the Lac des Chênes area of the Ottawa River. And then on the right-hand side is an example of the microvibe in the very right corner and the land streamer array being towed behind it. The passive seismic HVSR technique is being continually deployed. And it's a very common technique used quite broadly to map depth to bedrock. But there are additional complexities in the interpretation of that signal. And we'll see an example shown in a couple of slides. And so Barbara is working a fair bit on the multidimensional component of the signal and how to better deconvolve and interpret, where you don't have a simple, say, horizontal bedrock surface that you're trying to measure the depth to, but you have either a dipping surface or intervening horizons. That brings us then to the Embrun site. We worked on this in an earlier program involved with source protection in Ontario. And since then have put in a number of nested borehole sites, collected a wide range of geophysical data sets, and are working through that data interpretation analysis for publication. And this slide just highlights a couple of those publications. Heather Crow has deployed a downhole nuclear magnetic resonance tool to look at water content and worked up that data 2 years ago or a year ago. And she has a paper in review that's just received quite positive comments from the reviewers and should be out early 2022 if at the latest. Barbara, so just moving forward through some of the additional work that was collected this year. Barbara ran a linear transect of passive seismic measurements further to the south of Route 300 in the green circle, which was a focal point of earlier studies to verify extension of the esker to the south. And the two graphs on the right just highlight the different signal between Route 300 at the top and what is a bicycle trail or old railroad bed in the blue circle bottom right, and apparent absence of the esker continuing southward, at least within the distance that she completed her survey. So this data was collected in less than a day. I think she may have actually arrived on site using a bicycle. So just highlighting the portability and deployability of the passive seismic tool and its cost effectiveness for reconnaissance surveying. As I alluded to, Heather's been doing a fair bit of work with nuclear magnetic resonance. And one of the challenges identified in the earlier part of the work was magnetic susceptibility and the influence of magnetic minerals on the potential NMR signal and interpreting porosity and subsequently hydraulic conductivity. So that work is being worked up and is in in review, and as I said, received positive review and is moving forward. And that will address a significant issue in terms of the deployment and use of nuclear magnetic resonance tools in glacial sediments where you have highly immature shield-derived mineralogies that can have significant magnetic susceptibilities. Bell's Corners, the other component of the field laboratory development, is a 40-year-old downhole geophysics calibration facility originally initiated for mineral exploration in bedrock settings. You can see the triangular arrangement of the boreholes in the top left graphic there, examples of the borehole core below that. And Heather and colleagues worked up new laboratory data on the core to sort of bring it up to a modern spec and to address some of the new tools. For example, the nuclear magnetic resonance tools being deployed there. She's also working collaboratively with the University of Guelph and their frac borehole facility, fractured rock facility, looking at and contrasting borehole magnetic resonance tools in two different settings, a Dolostone limestone setting and the Nepean sandstone setting of Ottawa. And looking at tool performance in terms of like void volume estimation, the repeatability of measurements over hours or days. What are the best logging speeds? A stepwise progression or continuous progression up the borehole. Threshold response in terms of diameter of macro pores or fractures. And then also how it corresponds, the estimates correspond with the logs. And that work's actually in review. And to help further support the downhole geophysical approach, we've also been looking at CT scan core analysis for porosity permeability analysis. And Stephanie in Quebec had in a previous project worked up and published a methodology that compared dry core CT scan analysis with a fully saturated CT scan, and then through subtraction you can estimate different components of the porosity. And that's supporting both the Bell's Corners and Guelph work, and also some work related to deeper subsurface in southwestern Ontario. Geochemistry. We've collected a large amount of geochemistry across southern Ontario and continue to finish working that up. This year, a protocol for portable X-ray fluorescence was published by Ross Knight. Additional open files have been put out in terms of just standardization with respect to sample thickness. And we have one open file left from the London area to clue up data release on that. And then moving on to some other data collection that was completed some year ago for the Nanaimo area. So Champlain sea mud characterization, that brings us to Bilberry Creek in Orleans. And the map on the right just shows you the location of the two boreholes that are being studied in Orleans. And it's focused on both hydrogeological analysis and applications, and also geotechnical applications in the public safety geoscience program. And this year, significant work was progressed in terms of core extrusion and diffusion tests. An example of the porosity diagram to the right. And downhole geophysics was completed once we were able to get back in the field again. And Mark has been getting data from his piezometers, downloading data loggers to look at hydrological responses in the boreholes. And the images on the right just show some of the lab exercises and both at the GSC and the University of Ottawa, who are a key partner in two aspects of that study. The hydrochemistry analysis and extraction of samples from relatively low permeability material, and also from a sedimentological perspective. And on the sedimentological point, we've worked extensively with CT scan images to complete an analysis of the sedimentology and identified a 4-unit stratigraphic succession that can be characterized quantitatively using the CT scan Hounsfield units, which proved to be quite handy. And in the diagram on the left, the irregular line just shows the Hounsfield measurements against the CT scan. And that's being worked up by Omar Al-Mufti and Bill Arnott with Mark and Sam to provide a depositional framework for the sedimentology and to assist in extrapolating the information we're collecting beyond those 2 borehole sites. And the next step later this year is moving on to microfabric analysis. A legacy activity from the previous program cycle and the Southern Ontario project is ongoing work related to the 3D lithostratigraphic model, and the version 2 was published this year as part of Canada 3D, as shown in the bottom right by the citation there. And this slide is focused on what we're currently hoping to wrap up early in 2022 is a hydrostratigraphic model. So a reduced model number of layers. The lithostrat has 54, and we're moving this down to about 15 layers for the hydrostrat, and also providing static mapping of 3 hydrochemical zones, fresh sulfur and brines, through that area. And we also have ongoing work with respect to producing confidence maps and a confidence estimation for each of the lithostratigraphic horizons, which could also be expanded potentially to the hydrostrat units down the road. So we're happy to be participants in the Groundwater project led by John Cherry at the University of Guelph, an international initiative to provide open access hydrogeological educational material basically to the world. That's his grand ambition. Ours is more modest, just to help out. And Alfonso, who's now Rivera, who was the previous program manager and is now retired, is continuing to support our involvement with that initiative through chapter reviews and guideline development and some presentations for their Groundwater book webinar series. And Dave Sharp is working up a manuscript with Rick Gerber and people in the Toronto area on the Oak Ridges Moraine as an illustrative example of a major aquifer system, this setting specifically being stratified moraines. So in summary then, the archetypal aquifer studies are focused on eskers and glacial marine muds currently. We've had to pause the larger, grander objective of the project, which was the classification scheme. But I think in the next presentation on Canada One Water at the end of this series, you'll see that it's warranted and not without merit. Methods development is proceeding successfully through a series of field laboratories and improving our ability to collect seismic data and enhance processing, which provides much greater insights and reliability and confidence in the interpretation of the signal. Likewise, with the HVSR, we're trying to improve our confidence in signal interpretation in more complicated stratigraphic areas or more irregular bedrock terrains. And then the integration of CT scan work to support nuclear magnetic resonance analysis downhole is going to hopefully provide some very useful scientific literature support for the deployment of nuclear magnetic resonance logging in a more widespread manner. And then 3D modeling in Southern Ontario is advancing well, and from a GSC perspective, moving towards a closing point. So thanks very much.